And in particular, quite a bit of energy has been spent on trying to figure out what a viable so-called bridge principle might be. So that's following McFarlane's influential paper of 2004, which is still, alas, unpublished. And the idea of a bridge principle is the idea that you have a principle that articulates the connection between, if you like, entailment facts and norms that express the ways in which those entailment facts constrain our attitudes, or doxastic attitudes, towards the propositions that stand in the said logical relationships. So here's just an example, which I don't necessarily want to commit myself to, but you could have something like, well, in logic L, C is a logical consequence of a bunch of premises. If that's the case, then S ought to, or rather ought not, simultaneously find herself in a situation where she believes all the premises and disbelieves the conclusion, something like that. So a lot of energy has been focused on trying to articulate and trying to debate whether there are tenable bridge principles of this sort. But that question is actually orthogonal to the question as to whether logic itself can be said to be normative. Right? It might be the case, let's say, that there are true bridge principles. Nevertheless, it might be that the source of that normativity does not lie within logic itself. It might be, for instance, that in order to derive the normative consequences by way of these bridge principles, we have to appeal to extraneous premises that are not themselves logical, and where it's the case that these extraneous premises are actually the source of the normativity. Right? Going along with Hume, you can't get normativity out unless you put normativity in at some place. And given that we do get normativity out, assuming that there are true bridge principles, it's not necessarily the case that that normativity originates or is in some sense inherent to logic. It might be that it creeps in through some of these auxiliary but nevertheless essential premises that are needed to get there. And so the question I want to turn to is, or the question I want to focus on is precisely, can logic be said to be a normative discipline in the sense that it really is, as it were, the originator of the normativity that we would get out, assuming that there are such true bridge principles? So if we're going to ask whether logic is a normative discipline or science, we should first of all ask what logic is, and we should try to figure out what a normative discipline is. And when it comes to logic, I'm going to give a maximally unambitious definition of what a logic is. There's a formal language to logic, usually inductively specified set of well-formed formulas, and some kind of consequence relation defined over those well-formed expressions. It could be proof theoretic, it could be semantic. Right, so what is it? What is a normative discipline? Intuitively, some disciplines are descriptive. They're in the business of telling us what is. We seek to describe or to explain a certain range of phenomena, like in physics or chemistry. And in opposition to that, we think of some disciplines as normatives, paradigmatically, disciplines like ethics, jurisprudence, or at least according to most, epistemology. And presumably what makes them normative is that they essentially involve normative concepts and that they apply them to a subject matter that is normatively evaluable, right? So if we talk about subatomic particles, for example, that's not a normatively evaluable subject matter. Something like actions, forms of behavior, practices, mental states, things like that tend to be the sorts of things that we consider to be normatively evaluable. So it has to be a subject matter of the right kind, and moreover, it has to involve normative concepts. So I'm going to be rather liberal in my use of the word normative. Some people want to distinguish the genuinely normative, right, the sorts of requirements that are reason-giving as opposed to ones that are not, right? So for example, it might be the case that that there's a requirement that if you want to join a particular club, you have to wear a silly purple bow tie or something. Well, that is a requirement, but it's not necessarily genuinely normative, that requirement, because I might not have any particularly good reason to want to join the club and hence to wear that bow tie. Likewise, sometimes some people want to draw a distinction between the merely evaluative or the merely formal and the genuinely normative. I'm going to be rather laissez-faire about it, and then we can, if you like, go back to that and pick that apart in more detail as we move along. Moreover, I'm going to take it to be the case that normative concepts are such because they play certain normative roles. That is, they play key roles in practices of prescribing, forbidding, advising, praising, blaming, evaluating, and so forth. I'm not going to take any stance with respect to the meta-ethical questions as to whether or not these normative concepts designate certain normative attributes, properties, or relations, anything of that sort. I'm going to remain agnostic or neutral, at least with regard to that question. So the question then is logic, as I've very loosely defined it, like that? Is it a normative discipline in that sense? And there's, if you like, a traditional story, which may turn out to be false, according to which it is, right? According to that story, the subject matter of logic is reasoning, or perhaps thinking or inference or something like that, and it involves normative concepts. There's a further question then where exactly these normative concepts reside. We'll get back to that. So here are a couple of luminaries that sometimes are associated with this traditional story. We have Kant, we have Frege, about whom I'll say a bit more in a moment, and then we have more recent luminaries such as Grant Priest and Bill and Restel, and they seem to sign up to, roughly speaking, this traditional story. But I want to focus now on Frege, because although he's often taken to be the poster boy of the traditional story, I think he can also be said to have, as it were, anticipated what I call the counternarrative. That is the counternarrative that challenges the traditional story and which maintains, to the contrary, that logic is not in any distinctive way normative, that any normativity that it might appear to have is in some sense derivative, or it's only normative in a roundabout kind of way, which doesn't really distinguish it from other types of sciences that we would otherwise not recognize as normative sciences. So let me then follow Frege in my characterization of the counter-narrative. Right, here's some more Frege. He writes, the word law is used in two senses. So here he's speaking of the laws of truth. Of course, he calls the laws of logic the laws of truth. The word law is used in two senses. We speak of moral or civil laws. When we speak of moral or civil laws, we mean prescriptions which ought to be obeyed, but with which actual occurrences are not always in conformity. Laws of nature are general features of what happens in nature, and occurrences in nature are always in accordance with them. Now here's the crucial bit. It is rather in this sense, that is in this latter sense, that I speak of laws of truth. Here, of course, it's not a matter of what happens, but of what is. So in other words, contrary to what one might expect, given the previous quotation, which had Frege saying that logic is a normative science, here he likens logic to the natural sciences and as being a descriptive enterprise, right? And we're led to think of, or perhaps we're remembering the fact that logic's often, that Frege oftentimes thinks of logic as a kind of body of truth, and he thinks of it as a kind of descriptive enterprise. And that, of course, is, that view, of course, is supported further by the fact that if we look at Frege's actual logic, if we look at the symbolism, then the language itself does not contain any kind of normative vocabulary, right? We won't find any deontic modals, for example. And this is something that the following quotation from John McFarland points out. Consider, for example, basic law 2A. in modern notation, as you can see it there. This is just a claim about all concepts and all objects, to the effect that if the concept in question holds of all objects, then it also holds of the object in question. Here's a crucial point, right? There are no oughts or mays or musts, right? No norms in sight. So it seems to be a completely descriptive enterprise about what is. So the question then is, well, what prompted Frege to write that, that logic is, like ethics, a normative science? Well, the connection we can see here, because Frege elsewhere writes, any law asserting, so this is from the preface to the Grundgesetze, any law asserting what is can be conceived as prescribing that one ought to think in conformity with it, and is thus, in that sense, a law of thought. So in other words, even when it comes to descriptive enterprises, there's an injunction that inasmuch as we want to arrive at the truth, we ought to align our thinking with the deliverances of that science. Right? If we have a science that accurately depicts some portion of reality, inasmuch as we aim to have accurate representations of reality, we ought to align our thinking with that discipline. Right? So there is, if you like, a norm at work there, but it's just a very general norm to the effect that we want to have accurate representations of the world, and that if we want to do that with respect to the appropriate science in question, we should align our thinking with what the science tells us. And in a sense, logic is no different in Frege's view. So let me give you an example here. Right? There's nothing normative on this view now. So this we're moving towards the core message of what I call the counter-narrative here. Right? There's nothing normative about the logical concepts of like satisfiability or consistency or entailment or anything like that. And it's not hard to believe that if you take orthodox definitions of these things. And so if it's the case, if it happens to be true that the following norm stands, you ought not believe at the same time P, if P then Q and not Q. Well, if that's the case, that's not because there's some normativity inherent to the logical concepts involved, or to the concept of consistency in this case, perhaps, but rather it's that you cannot, it cannot be the case that all of those propositions that you believe in that case are jointly true. Right? That's something that follows from the notion of consistency. And so you ought not believe all of those together, because you might have an underlying epistemic norm to the effect that you ought not believe falsehoods. And you might get that from something like a truth norm, or of course you'd have to look at the details. But so the point here is that the normative import that seems that we often seem to associate with logical concepts like entailment and consistency do not actually have their origin within those concepts, within logic itself, but rather they stem from broader epistemic norms for which logic in this case is simply a handmaiden, right? Logic, the logical principles are simply play an instrumental role in promoting these broader epistemic aims that we have, avoiding believing falsehoods, trying to believe truths, and so on and so forth. Now, as I was gesturing at before, when it comes to saying whether or not logic has any kind of special normative status, it would seem that it's not the case, because all that we've shown is that the principles of logic, alongside certain broader epistemic norms, lead to certain norms as to how we should manage our beliefs and or broader, or perhaps more broadly, doxastic attitudes. But the same can be true about all kinds of sciences that otherwise we would think of as straightforwardly descriptive. So here's an example from chemistry. So if you've ever seen Breaking Bad, you know that fulminated mercury is highly explosive. That's a statement from chemistry. Now, if we add the following normative premise that you ought to handle highly explosive substances with care, then we can deduce from this that you ought to handle fulminated mercury with care. So now we've shown that from chemistry, too, we can derive certain normative consequences, certain prescriptions. But that, of course, does not show that chemistry itself is normative in any strong sense. It's only normative in a very weak sense, in the sense that chemistry, along with certain normative auxiliary premises, allows us to deduce certain norms. And so we've, and I should say, of course, that Frege himself anticipated this fact, right? He says that this holds, that is to say, the fact that we can, that any deliverance from these other sciences also goes hand in hand, comes with an injunction to believe in accordance with them. This holds for the laws of geometry and physics no less than for the laws of logic. The latter have a special title to the name laws of thought. They have, if you like, if there's anything that sets the normativity and the relevance of the resulting norms for our thinking apart from all these other cases, these other sciences that seem to be very much descriptive, it's only with regard to their scope, right? Only if we mean to assert that they are the most general laws which prescribe universally the way in which one ought to think, if one is to think at all. So we've now arrived at the core message of what I call the counter-narrative here. And I don't mean to, by simply drawing on Frege, I don't mean to say that somehow these later contributions had all been completely anticipated or not much worth. Gillian Russell in particular and her co-author Chris Turner have argued very forcefully for this very conclusion, right? That logic is only normative in this rather roundabout or derivative way. There's nothing inherently normative about it. It's only that the laws of logic only entail norms, if in fact they do, in conjunction with some other principles, and the normativity must really have the source in those other principles. And in that way, it's no different than any other science. And so sometimes that's been taken as a kind of additional feather in the crown, if that's an expression, of logical, of anti-exceptionalism, right? The idea being, well, look, logic isn't a priori, logic isn't analytic, logic is revisable, and the last thing that you might have thought is that logic is normative. Well, it's not even that. It's like all the other sciences. So it's not even the normativity that somehow sets it apart or makes it different. So I now want to just reflect a little bit about the counter-narrative and its core message. It's not that I'm convinced that it's wrong. In fact, I do think it has a lot going for it, but I just want to reflect on it a little bit with you. So what are some of the possible reactions on the face of it? Excuse me. Well, one reaction is just blatantly to reject the traditional story, right? Clearly, if logic is in the same boat as chemistry is, well, we said that chemistry isn't in any way, interesting way, normative, so logic can't be either. Another reaction we might have is that, well, perhaps there's some mileage to be gotten out of Frege's remark that even though disciplines like physics and chemistry and logic are not, that there's no qualitative difference in the type of normativity that they have. Nevertheless, there's something interesting and something important about the scope, the greater scope of logic, the fact that logic gives rise to norms, albeit in this roundabout way, that are not, that are universal and that are not specific to any particular field of inquiry. Another thing that you might say is that, well, maybe we should be a bit more careful here. Maybe we should insist on the fact that maybe there is some kind of dissimilarity in the normativity of the derivative normativity of logic and physics and chemistry after all. And you might think that there's an extra kind of oomph that goes along with the derivative normativity that attaches to logic, in as much as logic is something like constitutive of thought, as it's sometimes put, right? The idea being that in order for me to even count as a thinker, to be recognizable as a thinker, to be as someone engaged in conceptual activity and having beliefs, making suppositions, performing inferences, and so on and so forth, I have to be suitably sensitive, to the strictures of logic. Doesn't mean that I always have to conform with them perfectly, but when I make certain blunders and you point them out to me, I should display a certain readiness to correct myself in the light of that, and so on and so forth. So that's a well-known approach, and it's also been sometimes attributed to Frege, and it's not something that I want to think about, that I want to pursue further here. But I want to go in a slightly different direction. And I want to, first of all, say something, or simply observe something about the assumptions underlying some of the authors that have rejected the notion, the traditional story. So there's one assumption, very grand assumption, if you like, about the subject matter of logic. In very different ways, these authors maintain that logic just is not about a subject matter that is normatively evaluable in the first place. And moreover, they usually reject the idea that there's any kind of normative, that there are any normative concepts that reside within logic, or put it differently, that any of the centrally logical concepts are inherently normative. And so, of course, if at the outset you stipulate or you maintain, because it's very rarely that people argue for this very, very general assumption about what they take the subject matter of logic to be. In fact, it's very difficult to see how exactly even to adjudicate disputes with regard to that question. So people often just stipulated, they characterize logic in some preferred way, and they would say, well, logic is about this and that. And if at the outset you stipulate that it's about some subject matter that simply isn't the sort of thing that we could reasonably think of as being assessable normatively, then the traditional story is just sort of become impossible at the outset. It's not a contender. Moreover, this often goes hand in hand with the particular, sometimes usually tacit, assumption with regard to the value theoretic structure of the epistemic norms that are appealed to when trying to make sense of the derivative normativity of logic. So oftentimes there's some thought in the offing that there is some supreme value, some supreme epistemic value, like truth or knowledge, and that inasmuch as logical norms have their justification, it's instrumental, and their justification consists in promoting what is of epistemic value. Right? So if you, for example, avoid having inconsistent beliefs, then, well, it's certainly not sufficient, but it's at least a necessary condition for having true beliefs. And so the idea is that you have a broadly sort of teleological, or doesn't necessarily have to be consequentialist, but the idea is that you have some kind of epistemic value, and the idea that logic, the norms that you might derive from logic, have some kind of instrumental, play some kind of instrumental role vis-a-vis that epistemic value. I quickly want to introduce what I take to be a a helpful distinction, which is due to Graham Priest. And you'll find it in chapter 12 of his book, Truth to be a Liar, in his discussion of pluralism and monism. And what he does there is he tries to make sense of the debate between monists and pluralists in the first place. Because if you think of logic as simply being a piece of pure mathematics, then obviously there's no opposition from any kind of monist. Everybody will concede, or everybody will be happy to say, that there are all sorts of formalisms which we would ordinarily characterize as, or call logics, that are distinct in all sorts of ways. So there's a plurality of those. But of course, that's not something, there's no interesting debate between monists and pluralists there, because there's no debate to be had about that. Likewise, when we think of not just the piece of pure mathematics, but when we think of applying it in order to shed light on this or that phenomenon, there too, right? Even the most intransigent monist will be happy to say, yeah, there are all sorts of logical systems and they can be applied in all sorts of fruitful ways. You know, you can apply them, you can apply Boolean algebras to describe electric circuits. You can have substructural logics like the Lambek calculus that can describe certain phrase structure grammars, and all the rest of it. No issue here. So again, right, you might ask, well, what's the monism pluralism debate all about anyway? Well, what Priest suggests, and which I find helpful, is that among these many applications that we could put logic to, there is something like the chief purpose of logic, what logic is all about, what he calls the canonical application. And it's with respect to that canonical application that there is a genuine question as to whether or not you think that only one logic can do the job, or whether there are several logics that are equally good contenders for that job. So I just want to use this notion of a canonical application to point out that advocates of what I call the counternarrative here tend to think that the canonical application of logic is such that it involves having a subject matter that is not normatively evaluable. And you might, I'll get back to that quote in a second, and you can have all sorts of different disputes about what exactly that subject matter should be, what that canonical application should be. They all seem to agree that there is such a thing as the canonical application, and they disagree over what exactly it is. Nevertheless, they all are descriptivists with respect to the subject matter that is part and parcel of this preferred picture of the canonical application. So sometimes, Timothy Williamson in a paper on the semantic paradoxes makes the distinction between what he calls the deflationist line, which is what he takes in the metalinguistic conception of logic. I think, even at the risk of sounding somewhat grandiose, it's helpful to put it in somewhat cruder terms, right? You could think of the canonical application of logic as consisting either as being concerned with, if you like, the world or reality, right? The laws of being conception of logic, if you like. So, for example, Mikhail McSweeney in a nice recent contribution to Philosophy Compass on logical realism has this characterization: logic is for capturing the structure of mind and language independent reality. So you think that at some level, logic really is in the business of describing reality in its most general and abstract features. Or, very broadly speaking, you might think that logic is concerned with certain structural attributes of the system of linguistic or conceptual representation that we make of the world, right? So these might be metalinguistic properties and relations that logic studies, or it might be certain structural features of thought, depending on exactly how you think of these things and how you carve them up. But you see that there's a general sort of opposition there. For my purposes, I simply want to point out that despite the fact that there are these differences between how exactly the canonical application is to be understood and what the proper subject matter of logic is, what these crudely categorized, crudely classified approaches nevertheless have in common is that they are all descriptivists in their conception of the canonical application. Okay. So one approach that you might have, if you wanted to, well, if at least you want to think about what a comeback, what a counter-narrative to the counter-narrative might look like, you might simply take them head on, and you might simply say, no, look, I take the canonical application to be such that there's some kind of normativity built into it, right? At the very least, the subject matter has to be such that it's normally accessible, and there have to be certain normative concepts built into it. So here's a quote by Priest, which I'm not going to dwell on here. Right, so you might think that there's a sort of a fundamental opposition between descriptivism and normativism, as we might put it, about the canonical application. Right? We might think, okay, well, that's a really high order debate, and again, it's really difficult to think about how exactly to adjudicate that kind of question and what sort of arguments one might even think about mounting for one side or the other. So just to briefly, let me see how I'm doing time-wise. Actually, yeah, let me just say two words very briefly about the sorts of views that one, that I might point you to as a kind of example of a normativist approach with respect to the canonical application. And it might be something like, I'm not sure how committed he is to it now, it might be something like what Field sometimes talks about in his 2009 paper on the normativity of logic and his 2015 paper, What is Logical Validity, I think, where he toys around with the idea that he wants to take the notion of validity to be primitive, but he nevertheless thinks that in order to be a competent user, to properly understand it, you have to grasp its conceptual role. Right? We still, even if we take it to be a primitive, we're still owed an analysis of its conceptual role, and he takes that conceptual role to consist of its normative role, strictly speaking. Right? So in the simplest case, when it comes to full belief, you end up with something like a bridge principle of the sort that I mentioned before, right? If C is a logical consequence of a bunch of premises, you shouldn't find yourself in a situation where you believe all the premises, but you disbelieve the conclusion, something like that. Right? But the idea is that the role of the bridge principle that I just articulated is that of making explicit what is in fact the normative ingredient, which is already built into the very conceptual role of the notion of validity. So validity is, in a sense, a normative concept, because if we spell it out, we see that it has this normative import. Right? It imposes these normative constraints on how we should go about managing our beliefs. Now, there's a story as to why he thinks that that's a good approach, and I don't want to go into it now. Perhaps just to say that taking this kind of approach goes hand in hand, at least in the way that Field does, it seems to go hand in hand with a certain commitment towards conceptual truths, which some people might not be particularly comfortable with. Right? The connection being that a concept counts as a concept of validity just in case it plays that particular conceptual role, aka its normative role in regulating our beliefs. And then you might have certain worries about that, and you might think of the sort of canonical challenges from someone like Timothy Williamson against conceptual truths and epistemic analyticity in other contexts. So we might want to come back to that. I just wanted to give you a sense of what a view of that sort might look like, and what some of the challenges might be along that road. But let me just suggest a few other thoughts about other directions in which one might think of it. So other than simply opposing what I call the descriptivists with respect to the canonical application with a kind of normativism, right? So one reaction that one might have is simply to concede, again, right, to simply concede that normative applications just aren't canonical, right? They might be legitimate other applications of your logic, but they might not be canonical. But another attitude that you might take is you might question, given how different people's conceptions are of what a canonical application is, both within the descriptivist camp and outside of it, and given how unclear it is, at least to me, you'll correct me, of how exactly to argue for these different positions, and also that it seems to me that within the history of logic, it's very difficult to point to a dominant strand within the history which clearly would favor one or another of these conceptions. Given all of that, one might wonder whether this notion of a canonical application really has all that much going for it. How robust is it really? And why not simply start questioning that there is a meaningful distinction to be made here between applications of logic and the chief purpose of logic, right? What gives us the right to somehow privilege one particular application above all the others in this particular way? And it seems to me that insistence on the canonical application seems particularly odd from the point of view of, this should say from a point of view of a logical anti-exceptionalist. Because if you think that logic is like any other theory, and in particular, given its nature, it's like any other bit of formalism or any other applied bit of mathematics, then why insist so stubbornly on this notion of a canonical application, and why think that there's such a deep battle to be fought there? And I thought maybe it'd be helpful to step outside a little bit of the philosophical debate and think of the ways in which logic is sometimes thought about in psychology, and the psychology of reasoning in particular, because there logic is often thought of, along with probability theory and decision theory, as a kind of normative or evaluative standard against which to demonstrate usually shortcomings in our cognitive performances of the sort that we're all too familiar with. So here's a sort of standard expression of this from Stein, which is a paper about the so-called rationality wars in psychology and the cognitive sciences. And the standard picture, as it's often called, is something like what Stein characterizes it to be here. The standard theory of rationality is this: to be rational is to reason in accordance with the principles of reasoning based on rules of logic, probability theory, and so forth. By so forth, he means primarily decision theory, I take it. If the standard picture is right, principles of reasoning that are based on such rules are normative principles of reasoning, namely they are the principles we ought to reason in accordance with. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that we ought to simply take the psychologist's word for it, but I think maybe, and especially if we take a broadly anti-exceptionalist line here, which I'm taking from a distance because I have my skepticism about anti-exceptionalism myself, but excuse me. But nevertheless, if we take this general line, then why ought we to think of logic as having this special place and having this kind of canonical application? Because after all, if we think about probability or decision theory, we do think that these formalisms, that these pieces of mathematics play a central role, normative role, in our theorizing. And we seem to have no particular problem with that, at least if you'll allow me to be liberal about my use of the word normative, as I pointed out initially. And we're quite happy to treat these bits of formalisms as pieces of applied mathematics that can be part of models that are being used in science and in philosophy, and that in some applications might be descriptive and in some applications might be normative. So if we think of probability theory, and for simplicity, we'll just think of probability theory as being characterized by the Kolmogorov axioms, then, as we all know, there are various interpretations that we can give of those axioms, right? We can give different kinds of meanings to the primitive symbols, such as to make the axioms come out true and the theorems of them to come out true. And we have different conceptions of probability. We have objective ones and subjective ones of different stripes and variations. And of course, some people maintain that some of these conceptions are primary or basic and that one should be understood in terms of the other, but there isn't, it seems to me, the same kind of insistence, or there isn't any kind of analogous insistence that there is something like the canonical application of probability theory and big disputes over how exactly that should be understood. It seems straightforward that we can interpret the probability function in different ways, such as to measure our degrees of confidence with respect to a particular proposition, for example, or as measuring objective chances. And we can then think about how these different interpretations might give rise to models that interrelate in interesting ways. And so in closing, I just want to say two more very speculative words, thinking about why it is that we don't more readily think of logic as an applicable piece of mathematics that can be part of modeling types of activities. Now, Stuart Shapiro, who I'm very happy to see here, and a few other people have, in fact, pushed this line somewhat, although to my knowledge, they haven't gone very far in exploring the connection to the literature in scientific models. But again, Stuart and others will correct me if I'm missing important bits of the literature there. But yeah, my programmatic remarks at the end here are simply an invitation, perhaps, to think about whether it might be useful to think of logic really much along the lines in which we think of scientific models. So here are the main references that I had in mind here. Weisberg, in particular, Kollevin and Teitelbaum have two interesting papers in which they consider not merely modeling, but in particular normative applications, normative modeling, about which I'll say one or two things in just a moment. So quite generally, when we think of scientific models, what we're doing is, instead of directly describing or trying to predict something about a particular set of phenomena, we construct a separate object and we show how that object is related to the phenomenon in question. And we thereby try to typically describe or explain certain things about the phenomena. Now, concerning the ontology of the model, the separate object that we're constructing, it can be all sorts of things. It can be a concrete object, like in the case of a scale model. It can be a mathematical object, which is primarily what I have in mind here, but it could also be a computer model. It could be a host of other things as well. But the idea is that, so somewhat like a map, right? Rather than describing, for example, a mountain range directly by words, what you could do is you could come up with a topographical map in order to represent certain salient features about the phenomenon that you're trying to describe. And this is the point that I found particularly interesting in Teitelbaum and Colovan's work, that they conceive of the possibility to have not just descriptive models, as we typically have in the sciences and the physical sciences or in economics, what have you, where we're trying to describe or explain a certain range of phenomena, and we're trying to start off with a bunch of descriptive data or facts, which we're then trying to model and describe and explain. You could also have normative models, right? So you have the data here are certain normative facts, if you like, or to put it differently, to quote Collovan, you could have normative models, and unlike descriptive models, they're not supposed to model actual behavior or explain actual behavior, rather they're supposed to model how agents ought to act. And what's interesting, what strikes me as particularly interesting here, again in a very speculative programmatic way, is that if you look at cases like decision theory, you have descriptive and you have normative applications of decision theory, and likewise of certain models based on probability theory. And the same might be true of logic, right? Why not think of logic as a piece of applied mathematics that might form the basis of certain models, and those models might be descriptive, right? If we're applying logic in order to model or to put it to certain speculative metaphysical uses, need to be speculative metaphysical uses, say, or it could be normative, and we would then specify exactly how the formalism is related to the phenomena, the normative phenomena in question that we're trying to explain, and that we would do by way of bridge principles, right? We would make precise exactly how it is that the elements in the formalism are related to the phenomenon in question, for example, the belief sets of certain agents that we're trying to model. We would interpret logical concepts in a normative fashion because we're putting the model to a normative use. And we would have certain precise instructions as to how exactly we read off and how we interpret the deliverances of the model in order not to lose sight of the fact that it is a model and that it is, of course, oftentimes deliberately distorting in various ways. And yes, so I apologize. This at the end here is as I warned you, is rather speculative, but it is simply a question that I'm putting out there, whether you think that there's more mileage to be gotten by thinking of logic in these terms, and to take the notion more seriously that logic really can play the role of a model, which might be descriptive and normative, and that therefore perhaps perhaps the idea of a canonical application for logic becomes otiose in a certain way. Okay, I'll leave you with that. I went on long enough. Thank you very much for indulging me.